Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather with news, analysis, and commentary. President Trump's war on the FBI escalated dangerously over the weekend, and we are now in territory that is both familiar and frighteningly new. Familiar in the obvious parallels to President Nixon, a president I knew and who I knew to be obsessed with both power and with any enemies who might challenge that power. But with the firing of FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, President Trump has distinguished himself uniquely among American presidents. Because while Nixon subverted the Constitution and waged war with our institutions, he typically did so under cover of darkness, literally, when the Republican Party burglarized the Democratic offices at the Watergate Hotel. Nixon pursued his nefarious ends covertly. Hidden wiretaps, secret orders, dirty tricks, including illegal campaign tricks. Ironically, Nixon respected, or at least feared, America's institutions enough to try to circumvent them rather than challenge their very existence. Here is where President Trump forces us to confront something new, something to be feared. It's too early to judge the assessments made of McCabe by the FBI's internal watchdogs. We don't know whether he told the truth or not under oath. But however that turns out, it's never too early to defend due process. And that is now under blatant attack by President Trump. Yes, he indulges in Nixonian tactics, secret meetings, and aides covering up the truth. Just tonight, a new report identifies Cambridge Analytica, which consulted on the Trump campaign, as using bribes and sexual favors in political campaigns abroad. What is new is that President Trump is also bold enough, or conceited enough, to carry out much of his assault on our traditions and institutions right out in public view, online, in all caps, for everyone to see. President Trump is carrying out a personal crusade against McCabe, a vendetta on Mueller, and full-out war on the FBI in the open. When you consider that the FBI, like all law enforcement, does in fact routinely feed information to the press, half the Bureau may feel today like they've got crosshairs on their back. And that's exactly the point. Whether President Trump is doing this strategically or just acting on impulse, either way, it has the effect of signaling to any individual who stands up at the spear tip of America's checks and balances that President Trump will not respect the institutions that once might have shielded them, will not honor the due process our traditions once assured them, and will not hesitate to come after them personally, their families, their spouses, their financial well-being. Americans will get their say at the ballot box, but that's 8 months away. In the meantime, we are called to use fear of the ballot box as our weapon and our shield, today, right now. We've seen many Democrats take a stand. They're calling for investigations to protect our institutions. And we should give the few Republicans who have joined them some credit. Credit they can redeem after we see how steadfast they stand or how fast they fall when the waters get choppy. Where Mr. Trump most closely resembles Nixon is in his desire to end the investigation. His personal lawyer is pushing for that now. Of course, Richard Nixon gave up the office rather than see the investigation reach its end. He denied us even that. But Donald Trump shows no inclination of departing the office, and there is, at present, only a slender legal case for his impeachment, which means for now that he will stay, which means right now we the people have a fight on our hands. Our role in this fight is not to sit idly by until November, but to tell any and all who have sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States that we are watching now and expect them to honor their vow and will mobilize for November based on what we see. Not to get Mr. Trump, because it's hardly clear the Oval Office would be in better hands if Trump were to leave. The point of this battle is also not to defend McCabe, Mueller, or the FBI, but to defend due process itself, to defend the institutions charged with making the process work as a check and balance on power. For them, for us, and for Mr. Trump too. After all, if he's innocent, due process is his only path to exoneration. And if he's guilty, the upside to Mr. Trump's refusal to leave is that due process is coming for him too. And as long as we hold steady, as long as we will serve as the spear tip of our checks and balances, this time, in time, we'll get the truth. Now, I want to share an exclusive report on the truth about one of America's biggest gun makers, and I'll tell you about it right after this. I see what we all see, the deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled, we have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all?
And we're in the time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
We have an exclusive report to share about one of America's biggest gun makers, an exclusive report that could mean trouble for the industry. It comes, of course, just days ahead of the National March for Our Lives. That march will be led by survivors of the Parkland school shooting, and they will be joined by some of the world's biggest stars, or at least that's what my grandkids tell me. Just kidding. I'm very interested in this, take it seriously, and recommend that every American do so. And it's not just one march. Kids around the country are organizing their own, bringing parents, getting friends involved. The goal? To organize and galvanize a national movement aimed at dragging our politicians toward doing something about guns, not on the edges, not just background checks and mental health scapegoating, but something more, something really substantial and meaningful to battle our deadly virus of violence. That's the political side. But activists are also looking at the corporate side, figuring out how to financially kneecap corporate gun makers that spread fear and sell guns as a macho remedy for it. Every gun maker that sells shares of its stock to the public is required by law to warn investors about the most significant risks involved with investing in them. But corporate documents we've looked at suggest that some of the biggest gun makers are leaving out some very real risks that gun companies pose for investors, risks that gun companies have every reason to avoid acknowledging. This issue arose when one of the world's biggest hedge funds, BlackRock, asked the gun companies it invests in about the risks involved in making a product intended to kill things, including people. BlackRock is the biggest investor in the gun company Ruger, which made the rifle that killed 26 people at a Texas church last year. Ruger CEO Chris Killoy is a strong supporter of the NRA, having pumped more than $1 million into the group.
For all of us, it's important to give back to the industry we work in, But in particular, just as Americans, to protect our freedoms, it's so important to get the word out and get the membership dollars and the membership base energized in this fight to protect our freedoms.
In a letter last week responding to BlackRock, Killoy wrote that, quote, any risks involved with investing in Ruger are listed in their filings with the SEC, which oversees the buying and selling of stocks. So, we looked at Ruger's SEC filings, and we found two possible investment risks that Ruger has to know about, but does not warn investors about. You may not realize it, but you might also know both of them. The first one is politics. For years, Ruger has warned investors that if politicians impose new regulations, that will hurt their profits. Warnings like that actually helped drive profits up under President Obama, as the NRA, which Ruger supports, told Americans to buy guns now while they still could. But Ruger never warned investors of the risk if pro-gun politicians win at the polls. And we know Ruger has been aware of that risk. In Ruger's 2016 annual report, they said that year's political campaigns drove strong sales. And last month, Ruger CEO Killoy explicitly blamed the end of that campaign for slumping sales.
The decrease in estimated sell-through of the company's products from the independent distributors to retailers is attributable to, one, decreased overall consumer demand in 2017 due to stronger than normal demand during most of 2016, likely bolstered by the political campaigns for the November 2016 elections.
But Ruger's latest annual report does not include those very same factors in its risk warnings to investors. Even though Mr. Trump's victory has been widely acknowledged as by far the single greatest factor in sending gun sales and stock prices through the floor. Ruger itself has cut more than 700 jobs since a pro-gun president took the White House. And the other omission, Ruger warned investors that the company's reputation or finances could be hurt if its employees or contractors break the law or commit some other form of misconduct. But none of its filings warn investors that the company's reputation or finances could be hurt if its customers break the law. Now, it used to be that shares of gun companies rose in value after mass shootings, but that's not always the case anymore. In the days after Parkland, Ruger's stock price fell. But in their SEC filings 1 week later, Ruger did not say a word to investors about the risk that mass shootings might start hurting their investment. We spoke with Andy Green, former counsel at the SEC, who told us, and I quote, "This case highlights how major companies are facing significant risks from failing to fully incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors into their decision-making and disclosure. Corporate management needs to catch up, or else they may well see those investors or the SEC in court," end quote. A message we left for Ruger requesting comment was not returned. Now, who really killed America's biggest toy chain? Tell you about it in a moment.
All right, well, the Young Turks special election day coverage dropping.
An amazing power panel.
Look at this panel. You want to talk about power?
Like a smart Destiny's Child.
We're all too strong.
We start a revolution. Yes, another one.
Aren't you excited?
Wow. Some of the best writers in the country are right here on this panel, with the obvious exception of John Irola.
Let's not so quickly discount Harry Potter fan fiction.
We have elected the top Twitter troll in the country.
What ran me away from Christianity was judgment and condemnation.
Assaulting peaceful protesters in North Dakota, crazier than bombing Yemen, crazier than bombing Syria so much they ran out of bombs.
Reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts.
It's just
beyond.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
10 years after the last financial meltdown in 2008 and 2009, the House of Representatives is about to take up a Senate bill that will make it easier to blow the economy up again. That's according to a recent Congressional Budget Office report on the bill, which was sponsored by Republican Mike Crapo, but passed the Senate last week, 67 to 31, with the help of 16 Democrats. Democratic leader Chuck Schumer voted against it, but reportedly said it was okay for Democratic senators in close races to cross the aisle and vote with Republicans on it. Banks with assets of up to $250 billion will have fewer T's to cross and I's to dot to prove they're not too big to fail. These new rules for what are called, quote, smaller banks will affect at least 25 of the biggest banks in the country. And as we previously reported to you, the Crapo Bill will also reduce data reporting tied to racial discrimination. That will make it harder to find the patterns that can reveal discriminatory lending. But one of those 25 big banks has special reason to be interested in that data on race. Back in 2015, M&T Bank purchased a smaller bank called Hudson City. That sale had been held up for years in part because Hudson City was under investigation for racial discrimination. Hudson City, it turned out, opened more new branches in white neighborhoods around New York City than it did anywhere else. Only after M&T signed off on Hudson City settling the charges for $33 million did regulators sign off on the purchase. If this Crapo bill passes, M&T won't have to worry as much about that kind of thing. So M&T hired a lobbying firm to push for the bill. And as the Young Turks reported last week, 3 of the lobbyists who went to the Senate on M&T's behalf were former staffers of the Senate Banking Committee, now chaired by Mike Crapo. The Crapo bill faces opposition in the House from Republicans who think it doesn't do enough for the banks. Senate Democrats held the line against adding more favors for the banks. If the House puts those favors in their bill, it'll go back to the Senate again, and we'll find out just where each of those 16 Democrats draws the line. If the bill finally becomes law, which seems likely, and some repeat or worse of 2008 and 9 results, don't say you weren't warned. So, here's what they didn't tell you about the Toys R Us closings and how it ties back to President Trump. When America's largest retail toy store announced last week that it would close its U.S. locations, everyone blamed Amazon and Walmart. They told us Toys R Us didn't invest in making its stores fun or competing online. And that's true. But why didn't they? After all, last year, Toys R Us made more than $350 million, but reported a loss of $29 million. So where did it all go? To understand that, you have to go back 13 years, when Toys R Us was bought by a group of 3 companies. Buying Toys R Us cost $6.6 billion, but those 3 companies only put up $1.3 billion. They borrowed the rest, and then they handed those IOUs to Toys R Us. In other words, they borrowed more than $5 billion to buy Toys R Us, and then told Toys R Us to pay off the debt. The store has been trying to do so ever since. Toys R Us has been paying $400 million every year on those debts, more than it can invest in its stores or its website. Without that $400 million every year, Toys R Us would have been in the black last year. And you should know that the 3 companies that set this all up were Bain Capital, Vornado Realty, and the investment firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, otherwise known as KKR. To be clear, none of this is Mr. Trump's fault. But when you hear him talk about creating jobs and keeping stores open, you should know that the people around President Trump are very much the people making jobs in stores go away. The most famous of them is a co-founder of Bain Capital, former Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, whom President Trump has recently endorsed for Senate in Utah. If Vornado Realty is actually a business partner of President Trump, its billionaire CEO is Stephen Roth, a Trump advisor who has teamed up for decades on real estate deals with Trump. And then there's Mr. Henry Kravitz, the billionaire head of KKR. Henry Kravitz isn't just a fan of President Trump. He gave $1 million to the Trump inauguration. More importantly, President Trump wanted to nominate the man who saddled Toys R Us with crushing debt, Mr. Kravitz, to serve as America's Treasury Secretary. Folks, it's not just Toys R Us, and it's not just Trump. Republicans and Democrats alike have rewritten the rules of our economy so that now 40% of every retailer that goes under is owned in part by private equity firms like the ones that own Toys R Us. By putting the price of losing on us, we have freed up a handful of investor billionaires to gamble on our economy, playing with our lives in the process. At Toys R Us alone, it'll mean more than 800 stores closing, 33,000 jobs gone, at a company that's making money. So the real problem isn't Toys R Us. The problem is that in the new economy, we are toys. Now, I want to share my thoughts on what's been happening down in Austin, Texas, right after first, please, these messages.
Hey, Dave. As you can probably see, Skype froze. Frozen crash.
You know, I'm watching that documentary on the Vietnam War, and there was a TV journalist in the middle of some tiny little village in Vietnam doing live TV as the soldiers were burning the Vietnamese huts, and it didn't crash. And that was 1965, and he was in Vietnam.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all?
And we're in the time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
This has been very much on my mind. Police in Austin, Texas say whoever planted and sent bombs that have killed 2 people and wounded 4 more wanted, quote, to send a message. Well, I want to send a message too. You picked the wrong town. The first 3 bombs were sent to homes of people of color, claiming Black and Latino casualties. This weekend's bomb injured 2 white men, but it was random, triggered by a tripwire, not sent to anyone's home. So police say they are investigating whether race or ethnicity is part of the motive. I've had a home in and around Austin for 25 years, so I can tell you, if these bombs are meant to sharpen lines between people based on color, or they're a herald of white supremacy, well, as I say, you've come to the wrong town. It's not about toughness, though Austin surely has that. It's about young people. It's about Austin and cities like it leading the way toward an American future that cannot and will not be denied. A future in which inclusion, not just tolerance, but inclusion, is embraced. The road there is neither smooth nor straight, but whoever you're trying to scare, and for whatever reason, Our young people are tired of being told to be afraid of each other. I see it in Austin all the time. That's why they're leading us, the young people, away from division and fear and toward an American future where such horrible acts have no logic because there's no fear to trigger, no pointless hate to reignite. So give yourself up. The battle is over. You lost, and Austin's moving on without you. And finally tonight, a closing thought. One of the things we try to do in this program is provide at least some context and perspective on the news, especially some historical context when appropriate. With that in mind, consider the following spoken this week by one of the nation's leading historians. Quote, "It is likely that what we are going through now is going to be seen in the future as a landmark period similar to 1968. We'll be looking back and seeing it as a sea change in American political culture," unquote. The speaker was Don Carlton of the University of Texas. I think he's right. 1968 was a milestone decade, and there are some similarities between the political climate of then and now. In 1968, the nation was deeply divided over race, war, trust in leadership, and rapid changes in culture and mores. And some political leaders, Richard Nixon and George Wallace among them, were trying to exploit those divisions for their own personal and partisan political gain. Now, in 2018, there are clearly echoes, reminders of that past. Different time, different country in many ways, but the similarities are there for all to hear, see, and ponder. It took a while, but the nation recovered from the tumult and turmoil of 1968. Will it do so again once 2018 passes? This is not assured. The arc of history rises and dips in relation to each new generation. What lessons have they learned from the past? What action will they take in the present? What response will they have to the challenges of the future? It's my greatest hope that the answers to these questions guide us out of this sea change to calmer waters and to a time of peace and prosperity. With that, I leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and mark it at 7:30 Eastern. Stay tuned for the Bernie Sanders Town Hall, Inequality in America. That'll be at tytnetwork.com/live. And we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady. I see what we all see. The deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled. We have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.